In today's video, we're going to check out a relatively new and very unique plugin that provides a completely fresh look on creative effects in spatial audio. So without further ado, let's get started. But first of all, hello everybody. In case you're new here, my name is Michael Wagner. I teach at the Antoinette Westphal College of Media Arts and Design at Drexel University in Philadelphia. And on this channel, I talk about digital media, game design, and spatial audio. If any of those topics interest you, I invite you to subscribe or join my Discord community. Invite link is in the description below. And since you're already at it, also please don't forget to press the like button. Especially if you get any value out of my videos, it really helps out the channel and makes my videos more visible to other people. Thank you. The plugin I want to talk about today is called Stutter. It comes from a small company called Brewers. Now, Brewers have been around for quite some time. They are primarily known for their audio plugins in the Ambisonics domain, so they're primarily doing spatial audio or 3D audio plugins. And this is actually no way different. What it really does is it creates a stutter effect that you can apply to your Ambisonics channel. So in some sense, what you're really doing is you're stuttering the three-dimensional image of your audio signal. And that is something that you can actually use for some very, very creative effects. So let's have a look at that. Before I hop into the door, I should probably disclose that Brewers provided me with a free license for the stutter plugin. Now, while this is not a sponsored video in the traditional sense, it is about as close as I usually get to sponsored videos, so just be aware of that. However, nothing that I'm going to say Brewers saw in advance, and they also didn't have any influence. So everything that I'm going to kind of talk about is strictly my own opinion, and nobody had any influence. I'm going to work with Cubase today, and I'm working on a Mac. However, the plugin works fine in any digital audio workstation, and it doesn't also make any difference if you're on Windows or on a Mac. Works fine either way. However, it is of advantage if you have a digital audio workstation that is capable of handling Ambisonics audio, because the plugin really shines if you are using it on an Ambisonics track. However, it also works perfectly fine on a stereo track. So let me just have a listen on what we have here. It's a very, very simple pad that essentially is just a couple of MIDI chords on a track with an instance of tune and one of the factory presets, I think. And what we want to do is we want to create a little bit of movement in that pad. And we're going to use Stutter for that purpose. So I'm going to do that in two different ways. First, I'm going to kind of just put it onto the track itself to kind of show you that this is actually a plugin that you can use in a stereo environment as well, so you don't have to actually be in spatial audio. And then we're also going to use it in an Ambisonics environment and going to put it onto an Ambisonics track and see how it works there. So let me just kind of open up the track here and let's just add an instance of stutter. And here we are. And essentially the basic idea is that you have a buffer in the background, and this buffer sort of creates this stuttering effect. There are a couple of controls that you have. You have a dry control where you can either add the dry signal to the effect or not, and then you also have a gain control for the wet signal, depending on how much of the wet signal you want to have. And then here you have sort of the rate at which the stuttering is taking place. There are a couple of other controls, and I'm going to talk about them in a second. But let's just have a listen on how that sounds. And what I'm probably going to do is I'm going to switch off the dry signal here so that we have a better sense of essentially how this plugin works. So let's just play that again. So we can change the buffer size in order kind of depending on what we want the stuttering to do. So let me just kind of reduce that to kind of create a little bit more of a consistent stuttering. Now there are a couple of controls here on the side. We have a reverse control, so we can also reverse that buffer. We can also kind of play it infinitely. And we do have a knee control here. So the knee is essentially kind of responsible for this ramping up whenever the new slice is played, but we can also disable that. And then essentially you essentially hear a little click when sort of the new slice is coming in. So let's just turn the knee back on in order to get this little stuttering effect, and then we also can change the buffer. We have a control here that's called buoy, which essentially gives you a little bit of the main idea is that when you increase that, you're increasing the spatial nature of that sound, so you make it more immersive. So let me just kind of increase that here. So you can sort of hear how everything gets a little bit bigger than that. But in order to really see what this plugin is capable of, it is best to put it onto an Ambisonics track. So let me just do that now. And what I'm first going to do is I'm going to simply going to disable that plugin on that original pad track here. And I'm going to add a group track. And this group track is going to be an Ambisonics track. Now, the plugin works on any form of Ambisonics, so it can be a first, second, or third order Ambisonics. I'm going to use a third order Ambisonics track here. And let's just give that a name. Let's call that Ambisonics. And let's add the track. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to route the pad into the Ambisonics track. Now, why would you work with Ambisonics? Now, one of the applications, for example, is that you can use Ambisonics sort of as an intermediate format if you're working with Dolby Atmos and you want to create an effect for a bad track. So you could, for example, turn the bad track into an Ambisonics signal, then kind of put that effect on there and then kind of turn it back into a 7.1.2, kind of feed it into an Dolby Atmos bad track. So kind of there are many different ways on how you can actually use Ambisonics as a sort of a transitional format or an exchange format, if you will. So the other thing that I'm going to do is, I'm going to replace the decoder, the Ambisonics decoder that comes with with Cubase. And the reason for that is because the panner that comes with the decoder that comes with audio brewers is actually one that is really useful for us because it really gives us a very good impression of what actually is going on here. So the idea is that we see all the individual kind of Ambisonics channels and see essentially how the plugin is going to affect those Ambisonics channels. So if you don't have the audio brewers decoder, don't worry about that. I do, however, recommend getting that because that's one of the best decoders that's out there. So let me just kind of do that here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add a instance of stutter onto our Ambisonics track. So let me just open that up here. And it has recognized that we are essentially in Ambisonics. Let me just for a moment kind of switch that off because I want to just make sure that everything is working correctly. And I should probably also kind of move the signal around. So the pad is currently located at left and right speakers in the front of me. That doesn't really give us a lot of kind of spatial impression. So if I play the pad now, so essentially I see that everything is sort of located in front of me. Let me just kind of move that around a little. Oops, this is what we want to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move it back a little and then maybe up a little. And as you can see, sort of by doing that, all the other Ambisonics channels are kind of coming in. So that was the main purpose of doing it. So let's play around with our little stutter plugin. And before I do that, I need to point out one thing, and that is a couple of weeks ago I did a video on how you can use Ambisonics for some generalized mid-side processing. And back then I said that there should be more plugins that take advantage of the individual channels in an Ambisonics signal and kind of work with those in a more creative way. And at that time, I already had stutter on my to-do list, and I was very pleasantly surprised to find out that stutter is exactly doing what I said back then. It is using the Ambisonics channels in a creative way in order to create effects. So let's have a look on how that actually works. So let's first click that away here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply enable our little stutter plugin. And similarly to the stereo thing, I'm going to disable the dry signal so that we have a better sense of what's going on here. And let's play our signal again. So let's maybe kind of reduce the buffer so that we get a more consistent signal. Now, obviously, depending on what you want to do with the plugin, you would kind of change the buffer size accordingly. But for this demonstration, a smaller buffer is actually kind of a little bit more useful. Now, you can obviously change the stutter rate. So let me just kind of move that. Well, all the basic stuff, really. Now, where this plugin really shines are the spatial controls here. And the main idea is that instead of kind of affecting the entire signal, what you can do is you can select what part of the three-dimensional nature of that signal you're affecting. So you can say, for example, I want to affect only the middle, which essentially would be, if you followed my channel, the first Ambisonics channel. So it's essentially the mono signal. So if I'm disabling, I can essentially disable the sides, the front, back, and the top, bottom. So essentially what I'm having then is that the plugin is only affecting the mono signal, which once again in an Ambisonics environment is the first Ambisonics channel. Or I can say I want to only have left-right, so the traditional sides. And as if you followed me once again, you know that the mid-side channel is nothing but the side channel is nothing but the second Ambisonics channel. Now, what audio brewers have done here is they've also extended that idea to the higher orders. So these additional channels that are kind of coming in here are from second and third order Ambisonics, and that's actually really neat. In the video that I did a couple of weeks ago, what I essentially did is I treated the orders separately and kind of said that the side processing can only be done or should only be done in the first order. But what audio brewers have really done is kind of think about how that side signal actually kind of is affected by the second and third order Ambisonics portions of that signal, and kind of apply the effect accordingly. So what you have here is really the Ambisonics version of the side signal in a stereo signal. Obviously, we can also do the same thing for front back, right? So we see essentially we only have front back signal here, and we can obviously also do the same thing for top bottom. Now, there's not going to be a lot that I'm going to hear simply because the signal isn't kind of really far above me and there's not a lot of head information in the signal, but you can see that sort of there's something going on, and obviously I can also mix that. For example, I can say I want only the horizontal kind of spatial control, left, right, front, back. And I can also do that. Now, there is also the possibility for me to kind of change that or to kind of move that around a little. So what I can do is I can rotate, for example, rotate up. So if I'm rotating that up, you will see that sort of the signal sort of is rotated up here in the output. Or I can also rotate essentially horizontally, so I can kind of move that to the side, for example. And that will essentially rotate in the horizontal direction. So let's just kind of send that back. And I can also obviously just do the mono and mix everything together. Now that by itself would already be pretty nice. However, there's one additional trick that this plugin has up its sleeve, and that is that you can actually change the stuttering independently for the individual. Let me just turn that off for a second. But you can change the stuttering independently for the individual kind of spatial dimensions. So you can have a different stuttering effect on the middle, a different stuttering effect on left, right, a different stuttering effect front, back, and a different stuttering effect top, bottom. Now the way to do that is by enabling here this little button. So if I'm pressing that here, I'm going to detach the mid signal from the rest of the signal. So if I'm changing that portion here now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a different stuttering effect in the mid signal than I have on the sides. So let me just kind of play around with that for a little. So at the moment, essentially, the mid signal is on an 8th note, and the sides are on sort of triplets. And I can also change the volume. So for example, I can increase the volume a little maybe, or decrease. Let's just decrease it a little. And I can do the same thing for the sides. So for example, maybe I want on the sides, I want to have something that's even faster than 8. So I can say, for example, I want that to be, and I can, for example, increase the signal of the sides. Now, if you watched my videos, you essentially know that by increasing the side channel, or by increasing the signal in the side channel, what you're really doing is you're pushing that information to the sides. That essentially means that now the stuttering effect is actually further away from me than the actual signal. So if I'm mixing in the dry signal again, the stuttering will be, it's a very subtle effect, but the stuttering will be further away than the actual signal. Now, in order to make that a little bit more obvious, what you can do is kind of simply increase the gain of the sides here. And if I have it like that, essentially what I have right now is that the mid signal is on 8, The side signal is on dotted 16th, and the remaining signals are on 8th triplets. And obviously we can do the same thing as we did before. We can also change the spatial control, so we can move it up, for example. And we can actually see that here on the decoder, essentially that we've moved it up. But let's move that back again. I think that was fine. And then we can increase the spatiality. And this buoy, I hope I pronounced that correctly. If not, I apologize. But the main effect here is, I think of this like the object size in the Dolby Atmos signal. So what you can essentially do is you can increase the object size, which will make that signal more three-dimensional. So let's just do that. Let's just move that up. And that essentially increases the spatial nature, and obviously we can also change the buffer size. So let me just kind of increase the buffer size a little and see what we can get. I think that... And that is very creative. You can play around with it. It's really, really nice. It's really, really cool. So once again, you can do the same thing in stereo as well. If you put it on a stereo track, the only thing that you have in a stereo signal is that you don't really have the three-dimensional control that you get when you are moving the stereo signal into an Ambisonics track first, because then you essentially can change the position of the stereo signal. Now, if we go back into the stereo version of that plugin, there's one thing that should probably kind of show, and that is that you have some limited, let me just close that here, you have some limited control over the three-dimensional nature in the stereo version. So if you put it on a stereo track, essentially you have these two additional sliders here. One kind of talks about presence, the other talks about width. And that sort of give you a little bit, you can think of those as kind of ways to really position the stereo signal in three-dimensional space. The width really means that essentially kind of, what it really does, it kind of moves the signal closer to you, or kind of more towards your ears, if you think of it that way. And the presence sort of kind of really kind of separates them out a little. So those are two stereo controls that you can play around with. But other than that, this stereo version works in exactly the same way. So if you're on a DAW that doesn't really know how to handle Ambisonics, not a problem at all. Just use the stereo version and you can do exactly the same things that you can do on a stereo track. So what's my final verdict? Well, first of all, I think this is a really nice plugin that does something completely new, and just for that reason, I think it's worthwhile checking out. It's not particularly expensive and very creative, and kind of you can do things with it that you can't do with other plugins, and it works for anything, any digital audio workstation, any operating system, whatever you have, you can use that. So if you're interested in spatial audio, I think you should check that out and see if it works for you. Now, there are two minor grievances that I have with this plugin, and the first one is that I find the dry-wet controls a little disappointing. Let's put it that way. I can only turn off and on the dry signal. I think it would be more useful to have like a dry-wet kind of a slider or a dry-wet control that allows me to control both the amount of wet signal and the amount of dry signal independently. That would be, I think, more useful. And then the second grievance that I had is that for whatever reason, on my machine at least, the presets don't do anything. I'm not quite sure why that is. That probably is just kind of very specific to my particular setup, but just something to be aware of. But this is really everything I wanted to say today. Thanks again for watching. I really appreciate it. If you have any questions or comments, please use the comment section below or join my Discord community. Invite link is in the description below. And with that being said, see you at the next video.